Sleep didn't always come easily, even in the ancient world, so people turned to the quiet help of plants. Leaves, roots, and infusions gathered with care used to ease the mind into rest long before anything was measured or prescribed. Tonight on Made for Sleep, we'll move gently through how ancient civilizations used plants to induce deep rest, following the small rituals and natural rhythms that guided people into sleep. Our team has carefully crafted this story, researching and shaping it to facilitate your relaxation. Let the rain fall at its own steady pace, and if you feel like it, tell how life has been for you, and drop a follow if we deliver on what you're looking for. Long before modern medicine offered pills in bottles, human beings understood something fundamental about the natural world. Certain plants possessed the quiet power to calm the restless mind, ease the tired body, and invite sleep when it refused to come. Across continents and centuries, people cultivated relationships with specific herbs and flowers, passing down methods of preparation through generations, creating rituals that transformed simple leaves and roots into gateways toward rest. The reed basket sits heavy in your hands as you wade through the shallows of the Nile Delta, somewhere in the Middle Kingdom period when Egypt's agricultural rhythms have already shaped civilization for over 1,000 years. The water reaches just above your ankles, warm during the day but holding a pleasant coolness now as the sun angles lower across the papyrus marshes. You're here for the blue lotus, those pale flowers that close their petals as darkness approaches. Though a few still float open on the surface, their blue-white petals reflecting the amber light. Nobody thinks of these flowers as exotic. They're as common as reeds, growing in every waterway, painted on every temple wall, carved into columns, and woven into the headdresses of both gods and nobles. But their commonness doesn't diminish their usefulness, particularly as the day's work concludes and the body begins to register its accumulated fatigue. You reach down and cut several stems just below the waterline, where they're thick and green. The flowers will be used fresh tonight. There's no need to dry them when they grow this abundantly. The basket fills slowly as you move through the marsh, selecting blooms that haven't fully closed yet, ones that still hold their shape. Your feet sink slightly into the soft mud below the water with each step, and somewhere nearby a heron watches your progress with the patience of a creature that has all evening to hunt. By the time you return to shore, the basket holds perhaps 24 flowers, their stems dripping water that catches the low sun. The village sits a short walk inland, where the ground rises just enough to stay dry during the annual floods. Smoke already drifts from cooking fires, and the air carries that particular mixture of baked earth, livestock, and the green smell of the river that defines every Egyptian settlement. Inside the house, the preparation requires no elaborate equipment. You strip the petals from their centres, letting them fall into a wide clay bowl. They bruise easily under your fingers, releasing a faint, sweet scent that's somehow both floral and earthy. The petals go into a jar of wine that's been warming gently near the fire. Not hot, just warm enough that when you pour it over the crushed flowers, they begin to release their essence immediately. The colour seeps into the liquid, turning it a cloudy blue-white. This isn't about getting drunk. The wine serves as a carrier, a way to extract what the flower offers. You let it sit while preparing the evening meal, while sweeping the floor, while the daylight fades from gold to grey outside the small window. By the time true darkness arrives and the oil lamps are lit, the infusion is ready. You strain out the wilted petals through a piece of linen, leaving behind a liquid that's taken on both the colour and the subtle sedative properties of the lotus. The drink tastes sweet, slightly perfumed, with the wine's grape flavour softened by something harder to name. Green, botanical, faintly bitter underneath the sweetness. You sip it slowly, sitting on a low stool while the day's heat radiates up from the mud brick walls. The effect isn't dramatic. There's no sudden drowsiness, no overwhelming urge to lie down immediately. Instead, the edges of wakefulness become softer. The thoughts that typically chase each other through your mind as you try to sleep, tomorrow's tasks, unresolved disputes, worries about the flood level or the grain stores, these don't disappear, but they lose their urgency. The sleeping mat has been rolled out on the floor, layered with linen that stays relatively cool despite the lingering warmth. You lie down while there's still a bit of oil left in the lamp, watching the small flame create moving shadows on the ceiling. The lotus makes the transition from wakefulness to sleep less of a border and more of a gradual slope. You're aware of sliding down it, noticing the way your limbs grow heavy, the way your breathing deepens without any conscious effort to control it. This ritual happens throughout the Nile Valley, in houses grand and modest. The lotus appears in artwork not because it's rare or sacred in the distant sense, but because it's intimately familiar, part of the daily negotiation with consciousness and rest. The priests use it before certain ceremonies, the wealthy serve it at evening gatherings, and ordinary farmers like yourself employ it simply because the river provides it freely, and the effect is reliable. By morning the empty cup sits where you left it, a faint residue of blue staining its interior. The lotus flowers in the marsh will open again with the sun, and tomorrow evening the same process can repeat, as dependable as the river's flood cycle, as ordinary as bread. The hillside above the Greek settlement climbs at an angle that makes your thighs burn, even though you've walked these slopes your entire life. It's late summer, and the vegetation has that dried-out, dusty quality that comes after months without rain. But you're not here for the grasses that crunch under your feet, or the scattered olive trees that provide minimal shade. You're looking for valerian, which prefers the damper spots where springs seep from the hillside and keep the ground soft even in August. You find the first patch growing near a limestone outcrop where water trickles year-round, creating a zone of green in the otherwise brown landscape. The valerian stands waist-high, its clusters of tiny pink-white flowers mostly faded now, gone to seed. But it's the roots you need, thick and fibrous, growing deep into the moist soil. You've brought a digging tool, a simple iron blade attached to a wooden handle, and the work of extraction is neither quick nor easy. The first root comes free after considerable effort, bringing with it a clump of dark earth. The smell hits immediately, musty, earthy, vaguely unpleasant, like damp socks stored too long in a closed chest. It's the kind of odour that makes you understand why some people refuse to use this plant no matter how well it works. You knock off the excess dirt and drop the root into your collection bag, then start on the next one. By the time you've gathered enough roots to last through the autumn months, the sun has moved perceptibly across the sky, and your fingernails are packed with soil. The walk back down the hillside is easier on the legs but harder on the knees, and you take it slowly, letting gravity do most of the work while you maintain balance on the rocky path. At home, the roots need washing before anything else. You scrub them in a basin of water drawn from the village well, removing the dirt to reveal pale, twisted shapes that look less like medicine and more like something you'd throw on a compost heap. They need to dry before they can be stored, so you spread them on a flat rock in the courtyard where the afternoon sun still reaches, turning them occasionally so all sides get air. The actual preparation for sleep won't happen until weeks from now, when these roots have dried completely and can be grated into a powder. But you already know how that will go because you've done it countless times. A small amount of the powder, about as much as you can pinch between thumb and forefinger, goes into warm water or wine. The drink that results tastes terrible, earthy and bitter with a lingering aftertaste that makes you wish you'd eaten something sweet afterward. But approximately an hour later, sometimes less, the effect arrives. It's different from wine drunk or the pleasant haze of lotus. Valerian doesn't make you feel good exactly. It makes you feel less alert, less interested in staying awake, less bothered by the discomforts that usually delay sleep. The rock that's somehow under the sleeping mat despite your best efforts to smooth the floor, the neighbour's dog that barks at shadows, the slight chill that creeps in after midnight. The Greeks approach this plant with the practicality they bring to most things. There's no ritual attached to it, no prayers or special timing. It's a tool, like a hammer or a plough, meant to accomplish a specific task. When sleep won't come naturally, when worry or pain keeps the mind churning through the dark hours, you use valerian. Simple as that. You've noticed that it works better on some people than others. Your brother claims it does nothing for him except make his stomach uneasy. Your cousin swears it's the only thing that lets her sleep during the full moon, when some personal sensitivity to light keeps her restless. You fall somewhere in the middle. It works consistently and reliably, but it's not pleasant enough to use casually. You save it for the nights when you know sleep will be difficult, when you've had an argument with someone, or when your mind is already picking at a problem before you've even lain down. The dried roots, once they're ready, get stored in a ceramic jar with a tight-fitting lid to contain that distinctive smell. The jar sits on a shelf with other practical items: olive oil, dried figs, a small amount of honey. Nothing ceremonial or precious, just another household substance with a specific use. On the nights when you do prepare the valerian drink, you do it without enthusiasm, but also without hesitation. You grate the root, add the powder to warm water, stir it until the bits are somewhat suspended in the liquid, and drink it quickly to minimise the taste. Then you go about the business of preparing for sleep, banking the fire, checking that the door is secured, arranging the bedding. By the time you lie down, the valerian is already beginning its work, creating a heaviness in your thoughts, a disinclination to move or think or do anything except sink into the darkness behind your closed eyes. Sleep arrives like a slowly closing door rather than a sudden drop. You're aware of it approaching, feel yourself moving toward it, and then you're simply there, on the other side, unconscious until the dawn birds start their noise. The monastery garden sits enclosed by stone walls that block the wind but let in the sun, creating a microclimate warm enough to grow herbs that would struggle in the harsher conditions beyond. You tend this garden as part of your duties, one among several brothers assigned to maintaining the plants that serve both kitchen and infirmary. It's spring, and the lavender you planted last autumn has survived the winter, putting out new growth from woody stems that looked dead a month ago. The monastic day follows a rhythm that divides darkness and light into prescribed portions, prayers at specific hours, work during daylight, sleep during a fixed period that nonetheless never feels quite long enough. The bell that signals the night office also interrupts sleep just as it's reaching its deepest point, pulling you from unconsciousness to stumble through hymns in a cold chapel before returning to bed for a few more hours. This pattern, repeated daily for years, creates a particular kind of weariness, one that accumulates gradually and never fully resolves. The lavender helps, not dramatically, not perfectly, but enough to matter. You harvest it in late summer when the flowers have opened fully but haven't yet begun to fade, cutting the stems in the morning after the dew has dried, but before the day's heat has driven off the volatile oils that carry the plant's properties. The cutting fills the garden with scent, that distinctive combination of floral sweetness and camphor sharpness that you'd recognise anywhere, even blindfolded. You bundle the cut stems with twine and hang them upside down in the drying room, a small stone chamber with good air circulation and no direct sunlight. They'll hang there for several weeks, slowly releasing moisture until the flowers feel crisp and the stems have gone brittle. The drying process concentrates the scent, making it stronger, almost overwhelming when you first enter the room after the door has been closed for days. Once dried, the lavender has multiple uses. The kitchen uses it sparingly in certain dishes. The infirmary keeps it for washing wounds, claiming it helps prevent infection, but the largest portion gets reserved for sleep preparation, divided among the brothers according to need. You keep a supply in your cell, a sparse room with a sleeping platform, a small table, and a niche in the wall for prayer. Before the night office, when you know you'll need to fall back asleep quickly after being woken, you prepare a simple lavender infusion. The process requires only hot water and a handful of dried flowers, steeped until the water takes on a pale purple tint and the scent fills the small space. The drink tastes floral, slightly bitter, more pleasant than valerian, but less sweet than lotus-infused wine. You sip it while reading by candlelight, usually something devotional that won't stimulate the mind too much. The lavender's effect is subtle, more of a quieting than a sedation. Your thoughts don't vanish, but they move more slowly with less urgency. The physical restlessness that usually makes the hour before sleep uncomfortable, the need to shift position constantly, to scratch at nothing in particular, to feel vaguely dissatisfied with every arrangement of pillow and blanket, this eases away. When the bell rings for the night office, you rise from a light sleep, the kind that releases you easily rather than dragging you back down. You file into the chapel with the other brothers, stand through the prayers and responses, and then return to your cell while the lavender's influence still lingers. This second sleep comes faster than the first, your body grateful to return to unconsciousness, the lavender smoothing the transition. Some brothers prefer to keep dried lavender in a cloth bag under their pillows, claiming the scent alone provides benefit. You've tried this and found it less effective than drinking the infusion, but you appreciate the logic. The scent is undeniably calming, associated so strongly with rest that merely smelling it creates a kind of psychological preparation for sleep. The monastery garden also grows chamomile, another plant valued for its calming properties. The chamomile flowers in early summer, producing small white blooms with yellow centres that smell of apples when crushed. You harvest these too, drying them alongside the lavender, sometimes mixing the two for an infusion that combines chamomile's gentle apple sweetness with lavender's more complex floral notes. On the worst nights, when anxiety about some failing or concern about the community keeps your mind too active for sleep, you prepare a stronger infusion using both herbs, steeping them longer than usual, making the drink more potent. These nights are relatively rare. The monastic schedule generally exhausts you thoroughly enough that sleep comes regardless of your mental state. But they do occur, and having the herbs available provides both practical relief and psychological comfort. The garden itself becomes part of the sleep preparation simply through the work of maintaining it. The repetitive tasks of weeding, watering and pruning occupy the hands while leaving the mind free to settle. The scents rise from the plants whenever you brush against them, and over time the association between those scents and rest becomes deeply established. You can walk through the garden in the afternoon and feel a hint of sleepiness, triggered purely by the smell of lavender warming in the sun. The monastery keeps records of herb cultivation and usage, written in the same careful hand used for copying scripture. These records note which plants grow well in which locations, which combinations seem most effective, which brothers prefer which preparations. It's a practical accumulation of knowledge, driven by the simple goal of making the community's mandatory sleep schedule slightly more functional despite its constant interruptions. You write occasional entries in these records yourself, noting that the lavender planted on the south side of the garden produces more fragrant flowers than the north side planting, or that chamomile steeped for 10 minutes seems more effective than 5 minutes steeping, or that mixing the two herbs creates an effect different from using either alone. These observations aren't scientific in the modern sense, but they're methodical, based on repeated experience, and they slowly build into a body of practical knowledge. Years of using these herbs create their own kind of dependence, not in the sense of addiction, but in the sense of habit. You've grown accustomed to the ritual of preparation, the familiar tastes and scents, the reliable, if mild, effects. On the rare occasions when the garden supply runs low before the next harvest, when you must try to sleep without the usual infusion, you notice the absence more than you'd expect. Sleep still comes eventually, but it feels harder one, less smooth in its arrival. The Roman bathhouse represents a different approach to rest, one that combines heat, water, and aromatic plants into a multi-stage process that occupies the late afternoon hours. You arrive while the sun still lights the entrance, but is low enough that the day's business is mostly concluded, the time when respectable citizens begin turning their attention toward evening pleasures and the inevitable approach of sleep. The complex sprawls across an entire city block, its rooms arranged in a sequence designed to gradually prepare the body for rest. You start in the changing room, removing your street clothes and donning the simple linen wrap that covers what modesty requires, while leaving most of your skin exposed to air and water. The floor beneath your feet is heated, warm enough to feel pleasant but not uncomfortable, powered by the hypocaust system that sends hot air through channels under the tiles. The first room beyond the entrance is the tepidarium, moderately warm, where your body begins adjusting to heat without the shock of sudden temperature change. The air here carries the scent of lavender and rose, oils that have been mixed with the water in the shallow pools and sprinkled on the heated floors. A few other bathers recline on stone benches along the walls, their faces slack with the beginning of relaxation. Nobody speaks much. The atmosphere discourages conversation, encouraging instead a kind of peaceful solitude even in the presence of others. You sit for a while, letting the warmth seep into muscles that have been tensed all day, feeling your shoulders drop and your breathing deepen. The scent of lavender grows more noticeable as your pores open, and you begin to understand how the Romans have refined this process beyond mere washing. This is theatre of relaxation, each stage carefully calibrated to move the body and mind toward a state of profound rest. When you're warm enough that a faint sweat has started on your forehead, you move to the caldarium, the hot room, where steam rises from pools of almost scalding water and the air is thick enough to make breathing require conscious effort. The heat here is intense, purposeful, designed to drive weariness from muscles and fog from mind. You lower yourself into one of the hot pools gradually, letting your body adjust to temperature that would be painful if entered too quickly. The water contains more than heat. Chamomile flowers float on the surface, bruised and broken, releasing their apple-sweet scent into the steam. Your skin turns pink, then red, as blood rushes to the surface. Sweat runs freely now, and you can feel your heart working harder to cool a body that's being deliberately overheated. The experience borders on uncomfortable. yet there's a strange pleasure in it, in pushing toward the edge of what you can tolerate and then staying there, letting the heat do its work. Other bathers come and go, immersing themselves briefly before retreating to cooler rooms. You stay longer, having learned that the real benefit comes from sustained exposure, from letting the heat penetrate deeply, rather than just warming the surface. Your thoughts become scattered, hard to hold on to, as if the heat is burning away your ability to maintain coherent worry. Eventually you pull yourself from the hot pool and move to the frigidarium, the cold room, where water so cold it makes you gasp waits in a deep plunge pool. The shock of this transition, from extreme heat to extreme cold, creates a sensation that's both jarring and strangely exhilarating. Your skin tightens, your breathing catches, and for a moment you feel intensely awake, more alert than you've been all day. But this alertness doesn't last. As you climb out of the cold pool and dry yourself with rough linen towels, a different kind of exhaustion settles over you, deeper and more thorough than simple tiredness. Your body has been put through a process, heated, cooled, heated again, that has recalibrated its basic functions. Your muscles feel loose and heavy. Your mind, cleared of thoughts by the heat, seems disinclined to generate new ones. The final stage involves massage with oils, and this is where the Romans demonstrate their most sophisticated understanding of plant-based relaxation. The masseur uses oil infused with lavender, chamomile and poppy, not opium, which is controlled and expensive, but the milder properties extracted from poppy petals. The oil is warm, worked into your back and shoulders with firm pressure that finds knots you didn't know existed and gradually breaks them down. The combination of physical manipulation and aromatic absorption creates an effect that's frankly soporific. You lie face down on a massage table while the masseur works methodically from neck to feet, and by the time they finish, you have to make conscious effort not to simply fall asleep right there on the table. The walk home happens in a kind of dream state, your body wrapped in clean clothes, your hair still damp, your skin carrying the lingering scent of lavender and chamomile. The evening air feels cool after the heat of the baths, pleasant against flushed skin. Other bathers move through the streets with the same slow, satisfied pace, a small population of people who have deliberately exhausted themselves in preparation for night. At home, you eat a light meal, the bathhouse routine works better on a not quite empty stomach, and then lie down while the sun's last light still shows outside. Sleep comes like a tide, unstoppable and complete, pulling you under in what feels like seconds. The plant oils on your skin continue releasing their scents throughout the night, though you're too unconscious to notice. Your breathing stays deep and regular, your muscles remain slack, and you sleep through until dawn without waking once. The Romans have systematized rest in a way that acknowledges its complexity. They understand that sleep isn't something that simply happens when you're tired, that it can be prepared for, staged, enhanced through deliberate manipulation of temperature, scent, and physical sensation. The bathhouse represents a community's collective agreement that rest deserves this much attention, this much infrastructure. Not everyone can afford the time or entrance fee for daily bathhouse visits, but those who can develop a dependency on the routine that goes beyond the physical effects of heat and aromatic oils. The ritual itself becomes sleep-inducing, the familiar progression through rooms and temperatures, the known scents and sensations. Your body begins anticipating rest as soon as you enter the changing room, and by the time you reach the massage table, you're already halfway asleep. The Persian garden sits surrounded by high walls that turn it into a world separate from the dusty streets beyond. Water channels divided into 4 quarters, following the ancient pattern that represents paradise. Each channel lined with tiles that stay cool even when the afternoon sun beats down on the paths. You walk along one of these channels as the day declines toward evening, appreciating the sound of running water, the shade provided by fruit trees, the careful arrangement of flowering plants that creates a sequence of scents changing with each season. Tonight the roses are blooming, dark red flowers that release their strongest perfume as temperature cools. But you're here for something more specific than general ambience. At the far end of the garden, where the walls create a corner that gets afternoon shade, a patch of poppies grows under careful supervision. These aren't the opium poppies, the ones that produce the sticky resin valued for both medicine and pleasure, tightly controlled and taxed. These are simpler varieties, grown for their petals rather than their sap, valued for the mild sedative properties that come from steeping those petals in water or wine. The flowers are just beginning to open, their tissue-thin petals unfurling in shades of red, pink and white. You've been told to harvest only the red ones, to take the petals at the moment when the flower is fully open but not yet beginning to fade. This requires checking the plants multiple times as evening approaches, watching for that perfect moment. When you find flowers at the right stage, you pluck the petals carefully, letting them fall into a basket lined with cloth to prevent bruising. The work is meditative in its own right, requiring close attention but not much thought. The garden sounds, water, birds settling for night, wind in the trees, create a background that encourages a quiet mind. The scent of roses mixes with the sharper smell of the herbs growing in another section, and as the light continues to fade, the garden's temperature drops to something almost comfortable after the day's heat. By the time you've collected enough petals, the sun has set and the sky is showing its first stars. You carry the basket inside to a preparation room where other servants are engaged in similar tasks, drying herbs, mixing oils, preparing the substances that will help the household's occupants move smoothly from waking to sleep. The red poppy petals require gentle handling. You spread them on a clean cloth, picking out any that are damaged or have insects clinging to them. The ones that pass inspection go into a jar of sweet wine, where they'll steep overnight, releasing their colour and properties into the liquid. By tomorrow evening, the wine will have turned a deep pink and taken on a subtle bitterness beneath its sweetness. You've tasted this preparation before, in small amounts, enough to understand what it does. The effect is gentler than valerian, less distinctive than lavender, more subtle than lotus. It softens the edges of awareness without creating obvious drowsiness, makes the prospect of sleep more appealing without forcing it. The Persian approach to rest favours this kind of subtlety, preferring gentle persuasion to blunt sedation. The household's evening routine incorporates multiple plant-based elements, each contributing to a general atmosphere of winding down. Incense burns in the main rooms, releasing the scent of sandalwood and frankincense. Rosewater gets sprinkled on linens and cushions. The wine served with dinner includes herbs known for their calming properties, not enough to be medicinal, just enough to contribute to the overall effect. This layering of scents and tastes, this careful construction of an environment conducive to rest, represents a different philosophy than using a single strong preparation. The Persians seem to believe that sleep comes best when approached from multiple directions simultaneously, when every sense receives gentle encouragement toward relaxation. The sleeping quarters open onto the garden, allowing night air to flow through. You can hear the water channels from your sleeping mat, their constant murmur providing sound that masks the occasional noise from the street beyond the walls. The linens smell of roses, the air carries hints of jasmine from flowers that bloom only at night, and your last drink of the evening, the poppy-infused wine, sits warm in your stomach, beginning its quiet work. Sleep arrives without drama, a gradual dimming of consciousness that happens while you're still noticing the scents and sounds around you. One moment you're aware of the water's sound and the jasmine's perfume, the next you're aware of nothing at all, dropped into unconsciousness so smoothly that there's no memory of the transition. The Persian emphasis on beauty extends even to the tools of rest. The jars that hold dried herbs are glazed in brilliant colours. The cups used for evening drinks are carved from jade or shaped from fine pottery. The incense burners are worked brass, decorated with patterns that catch lamplight. These aesthetic choices serve a purpose beyond mere decoration. They make the preparation for sleep feel ceremonial, important, worthy of attention and care. You wake once during the night when the moon has risen high enough to send light through the open wall of your sleeping chamber. The garden is silver and black, the water channels glinting where moonlight catches them, the flowers reduced to pale shapes. The jasmine's scent seems even stronger now, and you can hear a nightingale somewhere in the trees singing its complicated song to the darkness. You don't feel fully awake. More like you're observing from somewhere between sleep and waking, aware enough to register sensations but not alert enough to think about them. The poppy wine keeps you in this half state, neither pulling you back to full consciousness nor dropping you immediately into deep sleep. You drift there for a while, listening to the bird, breathing the flower-scented air, and then slide back under without choosing to, claimed again by unconsciousness. By morning the wine jar will be empty, the petals strained out and discarded, the evidence of last night's preparation cleared away. But tonight those petals are still doing their work, dissolved into liquid, absorbed into blood, contributing their small influence toward rest. The Ayurvedic physician's room smells of ground spices and dried roots, scents so complex and layered that identifying individual components becomes impossible. You sit on a low cushion while he asks questions about your sleep. How quickly it comes, how often you wake, how you feel upon rising, whether you dream, whether you wake refreshed or still tired. The questions are detailed, probing, searching for patterns that will help him determine which plant preparation will serve you best. He's already examined your pulse, your tongue, your eyes, making observations about your constitution that use terms you don't entirely understand. Something about an excess of vata, about air and movement needing to be calmed, about your mind being too active for your body's natural rhythms. The diagnosis leads to prescription, ashwagandha, an herb he describes as particularly useful for those whose sleep is disrupted by worry or mental restlessness. The ashwagandha root sits on a shelf behind him, dried and shriveled, looking unpromising. He takes down the container and begins grinding a portion of the root using a stone mortar and pestle, working with practiced efficiency until he has a fine powder. This powder goes into a cup along with warm milk and honey, the three ingredients stirred until the powder is suspended in the liquid. The mixture tastes earthy and slightly bitter despite the honey, with an aftertaste that's hard to describe. Not unpleasant exactly, but distinctive enough that you understand you'll recognize this flavor if you taste it again. He instructs you to drink this preparation every evening, approximately 2 hours before you wish to sleep, and to continue for at least several weeks before judging its effectiveness. The theory, as he explains it, involves balancing energies and calming excess movement in both mind and body. The ashwagandha works slowly, building its effect over time rather than producing immediate drowsiness. You're meant to notice, after consistent use, that falling asleep requires less effort, that your mind quiets more readily when you lie down, that sleep itself is deeper and less interrupted by the thoughts that currently pull you back to partial wakefulness several times each night. You take home a supply of the ground root, enough for a month of daily use, along with instructions for preparation and timing. That evening you make the mixture yourself, copying what you watched him do, though your stirring is less thorough and some powder clings to the side of the cup. The taste is familiar from the sample you drank in his office. Earthy, warm from the milk, sweetened but not sweet. Nothing dramatic happens. You go about your evening routine, and when you lie down, sleep comes in its usual way, after the usual period of waiting and mind-wandering. You wonder if you've wasted money on something that doesn't work, if the physician's confidence was just salesmanship. But you continue the routine because you've paid for a month's supply, and because the physician was clear that the effect builds gradually. Each evening you prepare the ashwagandha milk, drink it while it's still warm, and continue with your normal activities for a couple of hours before attempting sleep. After a week, you notice something subtle. The transition from waking to sleep feels slightly smoother, less like struggling against your own mind. The thoughts that typically chase each other in circles as you lie in darkness, worries about money, replays of conversations that went badly, rehearsals of conversations that haven't happened yet. These still occur, but they seem to have less energy, less ability to hold your attention. After 2 weeks, the effect is clearer. You're falling asleep more quickly, and when you wake during the night, which still happens occasionally, you drift back under instead of lying awake for long periods. Your dreams become more vivid, though you're not sure if this is a property of the ashwagandha or simply because you're sleeping deeply enough to remember them better. The physician warned that ashwagandha works best as part of a broader approach to rest, and he gave you other instructions beyond just taking the nightly drink. You're meant to establish a consistent sleep schedule, going to bed and rising at the same hours each day. You're supposed to avoid stimulating activities in the evening. No vigorous exercise, no arguments, no intense thinking. Your last meal should be several hours before sleep, and it should be light rather than heavy. These behavioural changes probably contribute to the improving sleep as much as the herb itself, but they work together, each element supporting the others. The ashwagandha makes the behavioural changes more effective, while the consistent routine makes the herb's subtle effects more noticeable. The taste becomes familiar enough that you begin to anticipate it, to associate it with the evening's winding down. The ritual of preparation, warming the milk, stirring in the powder and honey, drinking it while it's still warm enough to feel comforting, this becomes as important as the substance itself. You're marking a boundary between day and night, between active hours and rest hours, using a plant that grows half a world away in climates nothing like yours. After the first month, you return to the physician for more supply and to report on effects. He seems unsurprised by your description, nodding as if this matches what he expected. He asks whether you want to continue or try something different, and you realise the question is easy. Whatever combination of factors has improved your sleep, you're not interested in changing it. You buy another month's supply, then another. The dependence that develops isn't addiction in any meaningful sense. You can sleep without the ashwagandha, and you've proven this on occasions when you've travelled or simply run out of supply. But sleep comes harder without it, less reliably, with more wakefulness during the night. The herb has become part of your body's expectation of evening, and removing it creates a gap that your physiology notices. Years of use create their own feedback loop. The improved sleep makes you generally calmer during the day, less prone to the anxiety that originally disrupted your rest. This daytime calmness should, theoretically, make the nighttime herb less necessary. But by now the ritual has become fixed, and you continue the nightly preparation more from habit than necessity, unable to imagine evenings without that familiar earthy taste, that feeling of having done something intentional to support rest. The convent's herbarium occupies a building separate from the main dormitory, its own stone structure with a tiled roof and windows facing south to maximise light. Inside, the air stays cool year-round, perfect for preserving dried plants that hang from ceiling beams in bundles or rest in labelled jars along the walls. You work here several hours each day, processing harvests from the garden, preparing medicines and helpful substances for the community. Today you're working with lemon balm, a plant that grows so enthusiastically in the garden that it requires constant harvesting to keep it from taking over the beds, meant for other herbs. The fresh stems are bright green, the leaves heavily textured and releasing their distinctive scent, lemony but also minty, slightly sharp whenever you brush against them. You strip leaves from stems, discarding any that show signs of disease or insect damage, keeping only the perfect ones for drying. The lemon balm will be used primarily in evening teas, both for the community here and for lay people who come seeking help with sleeplessness. It's gentler than valerian, more reliably effective than chamomile alone, and pleasant tasting enough that people actually enjoy drinking it rather than forcing it down as medicine. You work slowly, methodically, finding the rhythm that makes repetitive tasks meditative. Your hands move automatically, strip, inspect, keep or discard, while your mind stays mostly quiet, occasionally forming prayers but more often just resting in the simple, physical reality of the work. The scent of lemon balm fills the herbarium, fresh and clean, cutting through the mustier smells of dried roots and older herbs. Another sister enters carrying a basket of freshly harvested calendula flowers, their orange petals bright even in the dim interior light. She works at a different table, beginning her own processing task, and for a while you work in companionable silence, the kind of shared quiet that feels comfortable rather than awkward. The sleep preparation you'll make tonight for yourself uses lemon balm as its base but includes other herbs as well. A small amount of passion flower for its calming properties, a pinch of dried hops that contributes bitterness but also sedative effect, and a bit of lavender because the combination of lemon balm and lavender creates a taste more pleasant than either alone. The proportions matter. Too much hops makes the tea undrinkably bitter. Too little passion flower and you might as well just drink lemon balm by itself. You've learned these ratios through years of experimentation, adjusting and readjusting until finding a combination that tastes acceptable and produces reliable effects. The convent day includes evening prayers that happen after full darkness, requiring you to be awake at an hour when your body would prefer to be sleeping. The herbal tea helps with this strange schedule, allowing you to stay alert through the prayers without feeling wired or agitated, then facilitating quick sleep once you're finally allowed to retire. You prepare the tea in your cell, using water heated over a small lamp, steeping the mixed herbs until the liquid turns pale yellow-green, and the combined scents fill the narrow space. The taste is complex: lemon balm's brightness, lavender's floral note, the bitter edge of hops, something harder to name that must come from the passion flower. You've grown to like it, or at least to appreciate it, the way you might appreciate any taste that's become deeply associated with rest. The prayers happen, as they always do, pulling you from the drowsy state the tea induces back to full wakefulness. You stand and kneel and sit through the familiar liturgy, your voice joining others in hymns you've sung so many times you could perform them while fully asleep. The chapel is cold, lit by candles that create more shadow than light, and you're grateful when the final prayers conclude and you're released back to your cell. Sleep comes quickly once you're horizontal, the herbs still working their way through your system, your body dropping into unconsciousness, with the relief of a burden set down. You don't dream much, or at least you don't remember dreams, and you wake when the morning bell rings feeling more rested than the hours of actual sleep should allow. The herbarium keeps records, just like the monastery you once heard about, documenting which plants grow well in which conditions, which combinations seem most effective for which purposes, which sisters prefer, which preparations. These records aren't scientific, but they're systematic, building a body of knowledge that will survive beyond any individual's lifetime. You've made entries yourself, noting that lemon balm planted in partial shade produces more aromatic leaves than full sun plantings, that passion flower needs support structures to climb, that hops harvested slightly before full maturity are less bitter than fully mature cones. These observations join hundreds of others, creating a manuscript that's part gardening manual, part pharmacy reference, part community history. The knowledge feels precious in a way that's hard to articulate. You're preserving something that could easily be lost. The understanding of which plants help with rest, how to prepare them, how to combine them for different effects. This knowledge predates the convent, passed down through generations of women who learned it from their mothers and grandmothers, but it's also constantly evolving as new observations add to old wisdom. The night market operates by lamplight, creating a temporary world that exists only after sunset. You walk between stalls selling food, cloth, tools and, in one section that draws you like gravity, herbs and spices. The vendor you're seeking specializes in plants from distant regions, things that don't grow locally but arrive via trade routes that stretch across continents. Tonight you're here for something specific, dried chamomile from Egypt, which is said to be superior to the local variety. The flowers are smaller than the chamomile that grows in your own garden, more intensely scented with a sweeter apple fragrance. The vendor lets you smell a sample, crushing a few flowers between his fingers to release their full aroma. The scent is indeed remarkable, more concentrated than anything you've grown yourself. You buy a small quantity, it's expensive, imported goods always are, and also purchase some dried orange peel, which you've heard pairs well with chamomile for evening drinks. At home, you experiment with proportions, trying different ratios of chamomile to orange peel, steeping for various lengths of time, adjusting water temperature. The best combination turns out to be mostly chamomile with just a small amount of orange peel, steeped in water that's hot but not quite boiling, for approximately 7 minutes. The resulting tea tastes like apples and oranges had a child that was somehow more subtle than either parent. The chamomile's natural sweetness gets enhanced by the orange peel's faint bitterness, creating a flavour that's interesting enough to drink for pleasure, but calming enough to serve its purpose as sleep preparation. You drink this tea in the hour before bed, sitting near a window where you can watch the last activity in the street below gradually diminish as night deepens. The tea's warmth spreads through your chest and stomach, and the familiar relaxation begins. Shoulders dropping, breathing deepening, thoughts slowing their frantic pace. The Egyptian chamomile does seem more effective than your local variety, though you can't be certain whether this is objectively true or just the psychological effect of believing it should work better, because it's exotic and expensive. Either way, the result is the same. Sleep comes more easily on nights when you drink this particular blend than on nights when you don't. You begin growing protective of your supply, rationing it carefully to make it last, using it only when you particularly need help sleeping rather than every single night. This transforms the tea from routine to treat, something special reserved for difficult nights when rest feels most elusive. The market vendor becomes familiar with your regular purchases, sometimes setting aside particularly good chamomile when his supplier brings a fresh shipment. You develop a relationship built around these small transactions. Your money for his plants, his knowledge of sources and quality for your appreciation and loyalty. He tells you stories about the origins of what he sells, describing Egyptian fields where chamomile grows in such profusion that the air smells of apples for miles, or mountain valleys where lavender blooms in sheets of purple that attract bees from every direction. You suspect some of these stories are exaggerated or entirely invented, but they add value beyond the physical product, connecting you to distant places and the people who grow these plants. The rituals of acquisition and preparation become as important as the effects of consumption. Walking to the night market, evaluating quality, negotiating price, carrying home your purchase, experimenting with preparation, finding the optimal combination. All of these steps contribute to the overall experience of using plants for rest. The darkness in your room has become complete now. The lamp burned down to nothing, the window showing only the faint difference between inside darkness and outside darkness. You've been lying here for some time, impossible to say how long without light to mark time's passage, letting the various influences of herbs and routine and deliberate quieting do their work. Your breathing has found a rhythm that requires no thought, deep and slow, each exhale lasting slightly longer than the inhale. The bed beneath you has stopped feeling like something separate from your body and started feeling like an extension of it, or perhaps you've extended into it, boundaries blurring in the way they do when consciousness begins its slide towards sleep. The scents that filled the room earlier, whatever plant you used tonight, though the specific identity is becoming hard to recall, have faded to the point where you notice them only occasionally when breathing catches them at a particular angle. They're background now, part of the atmosphere rather than a distinct sensation. Your mind has stopped producing coherent thoughts and switched to something more like images, disconnected fragments that drift past without requiring attention or response. A garden you worked in once, a river you crossed, hands preparing something in a bowl, though whose hands and what substance you can't quite determine. This state between waking and sleeping feels comfortable rather than frustrating, a place you could remain indefinitely without complaint. The usual urgency to actually achieve sleep, to make the transition happen, has dissolved. If sleep comes, fine. If it doesn't, also fine. The distinction between the two states matters less than it did when evening first arrived. The plants have done what they do, subtle or strong, quick or slow, each in its own way moving the body and mind towards stillness. The chamomile and lavender and valerian and lotus and ashwagandha and lemon balm, the poppy petals and rose scents and herb-infused oils, all the careful preparations and thoughtful rituals, the accumulated wisdom of generations who noticed what grew around them and learned to use it, these have created conditions favourable to rest. But the actual transition, the moment when awareness finally releases and unconsciousness claims you completely, this can't be forced or scheduled or guaranteed, regardless of how many herbs you use or how perfectly you follow ancient prescriptions. It happens when it happens, or it doesn't happen at all, and the plants can only increase the likelihood, make the waiting more comfortable, smooth the path but not control the destination. You're aware of this even in your current half state, aware that you're waiting for something that will arrive in its own time, or possibly not arrive at all, and that this uncertainty is fine, acceptable, not worth worrying about. The darkness holds you without pressure, the silence wraps around you without demanding anything, and somewhere in this gentle suspension between states, the final letting go occurs. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're still here, still aware, still noticing the way breath moves in and out, the way the mattress presses up against your back, the way sounds from outside, distant, muffled, unidentifiable, reach you through whatever walls separate inside from outside. Maybe sleep is still approaching, or maybe it's already happened and what remains is some fragment of consciousness too small to notice its own sleeping. The plants can't answer this question. They've done their part, contributed what chemistry and scent and ritual can contribute, and now the rest is up to processes beyond their influence, beyond anyone's influence. The body will do what it does, the mind will follow or not follow, and eventually morning will arrive whether you've slept through the intervening hours or simply rested in darkness while time passed. The thought of morning already feels distant, irrelevant, something that might as well be years away for all the immediacy it carries. Right now there's only this, darkness, breath, the slowly diminishing awareness of being aware, the gentle dissolving of boundaries between you and the bed and the room and the night itself. Somewhere in all this dissolving, in this gradual releasing of the need to maintain consciousness, sleep finds its opening, not with drama or announcement, not with a clear moment when you could say, now I'm falling asleep, but rather with a fading so gradual that there's no single point where wake becomes sleep, only a continuum that grows dimmer and dimmer until finally, without your noticing the transition, you're simply gone. You know that feeling when you're scrolling through your phone at 2 in the morning, ignoring every reasonable signal your body sends about needing sleep. Turns out, humans have been spectacularly good at ignoring warnings for thousands of years. The difference is the ancient ones actually wrote theirs down. We just decided they were talking about dragons and curses instead of, actual survival advice. Tonight, we're going to explore those old stories everyone dismissed as superstition, the ones that turned out to be instruction manuals we forgot how to read. Picture yourself sitting in a landscape that doesn't quite make sense to modern eyes. Not ancient in the way movies show it, all torches and mysterious robes, but ancient in a more practical way. A world where the evening sky looks subtly different because there are fewer particles in the atmosphere, where silence actually means silence, not the background hum of distant highways and air conditioning units. You're in what will someday be called the Mediterranean, about 7,000 years ago, in a settlement that archaeology will later label with a catalogue number, instead of the name its inhabitants actually used. 37 houses made of mud, brick and stone, arranged in a rough circle around a central gathering space. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business for better or worse, which honestly hasn't changed much in 7 millennia. The houses have flat roofs where people sleep during hot months, and you can smell bread baking in outdoor ovens, mixed with the sharper scent of goats penned nearby. Someone is crushing grain with a stone. You can hear the rhythmic grinding sound that would become oddly soothing if you lived with it every day. A couple of kids are playing some game involving tossing pebbles, arguing about rules in voices that carry across the whole village. Here's the thing about this place. Nobody wakes up thinking, I'm going to create mythology today. They're thinking about whether the grain storage looks low, whether that cough means someone's actually sick, and whether they should plant barley in the eastern field this year. Practical thoughts. Boring thoughts, really. But there's one person in the village who's older than almost everyone else, maybe 60, which is genuinely impressive for this time period. She's seen things, patterns, the kind of observations that only come from decades of paying attention to the same landscape, the same seasons, and the same subtle shifts that mean something important is about to happen. She's noticed, for instance, that when the swallows arrive later than usual in spring, the summer rains also come late. This has happened enough times that it's not a coincidence. She's also noticed that when certain flowers bloom early, frost sometimes returns and kills the young crops. Again, pattern. Not magic, just weather being weather, following rules she can't explain but can definitely observe. The problem is memory. Her memory is sharp enough, but she won't live forever, and knowledge that exists only in one person's head might as well not exist at all. So she does what humans have done forever when they need to remember something important. She turns it into a story. Not just any story. A good story. The kind people want to hear again. She tells the children that the swallows carry messages from the sky spirits about rain, and that you must always wait for the swallows before planting certain crops. She describes the early blooming flowers as tricksters, beautiful but deceptive, warning farmers not to trust their appearance. Is she lying? Not exactly. She's encoding information in the most durable format available to a preliterate society. Narrative that sticks in memory, passes from parent to child and becomes tradition. The metaphors about spirits and tricksters aren't the point. The instructions hidden inside them are the point. You can see this same pattern everywhere if you look closely enough. The sacred groves that must never be cut down, usually located in areas where tree removal would cause erosion or flooding. The cursed caves that must be avoided, often containing pockets of carbon dioxide or other invisible dangers. The dietary restrictions about certain shellfish during specific months, aligning suspiciously well with seasonal toxin blooms that nobody could measure, but everyone could observe the effects of. The stories spread outward from that village, changing slightly as they travelled. Someone adds a detail about a hero. Someone else makes the trickster flowers into actual malevolent beings. The core instruction remains, but the packaging gets more elaborate, more entertaining and more memorable. Within a few generations, people are following the rules without necessarily remembering why the rules exist. They just know that grandfather and great-grandfather always waited for the swallows, and things went badly the one year great-uncle decided he knew better. The story has done its job, preserving behaviour that increases survival even after the original reasoning is forgotten. Think about how weird this is. The entire system depends on people following instructions they don't fully understand, embedded in stories they believe for reasons that have nothing to do with empirical observation. It works precisely because humans are naturally good at pattern recognition and storytelling, even when we're not particularly good at distinguishing correlation from causation. Archaeology reveals these layers slowly, frustratingly. You find a settlement that was mysteriously abandoned, and you can measure the flood deposits that came after. You find another one built in what seems like a terrible location, until you realise it's positioned exactly where it would avoid a landslide that apparently happened every few generations. Did the builders know this consciously? Or were they following a tradition about where villages should and shouldn't be built? A tradition that sounded like superstition but was actually distilled geological knowledge? The honest answer is probably both. Some people undoubtedly understood the practical reasons. Others just knew that the ancestors say we don't build there, and that was enough. The result was the same either way. Communities that survived because they listened to stories. You start to notice this pattern everywhere once you're looking for it. The agricultural calendar disguised as religious festivals. The hygiene practices are wrapped in ritual purity. The building techniques are described in terms of pleasing the gods, but coincidentally create structures that survive earthquakes better than the ones built by people who ignored the old ways. It's not that the ancients were stupid, it's that they were solving a specific problem. How do you preserve and transmit crucial survival information across generations when you can't write it down? And even if you could, most people couldn't read. You make it memorable, you make it sacred, you make it into something people will defend and preserve even when they don't remember why it matters. The really clever part is how self-reinforcing the system becomes. If someone ignores the warning and nothing bad happens, well, they were lucky. If something bad does happen, the story is confirmed and strengthened. Over enough iterations, the warnings that were genuinely useful stick around, while the purely superstitious ones tend to fade unless they serve some other social function, except, of course, when they don't. When everything gets so mixed up together that you can't separate the practical warnings from the cultural barnacles that attach themselves along the way, that's when things get complicated. Here's something that would have seemed absurdly magical to ancient peoples. You can predict the future by counting things and noticing when the numbers change. Not dramatically, just slightly, consistently, in ways that mean something if you're patient enough to watch. You're now in what will eventually become Iraq, around 5,000 years ago, in a city that will collapse and be rebuilt several times before finally being abandoned to the desert. It's evening, and you're standing on a ziggurat step looking at the sky. Not for religious reasons, though religion is certainly involved. You're looking because you're responsible for the agricultural calendar, and that means you need to know exactly when the flood will come. The Tigris and Euphrates don't flood randomly. They flood predictably, following the snowmelt pattern in mountains hundreds of miles away, mountains you've never seen and never will. But you don't need to see them. You just need to track the stars. Certain stars appear in certain positions when the flood is approximately 40 days away. This correlation has been observed and recorded for generations, first in memory, now increasingly in clay tablets, with wedge-shaped marks that represent numbers and concepts. You're not thinking about the physics of planetary motion, or the hydrology of watersheds. You're thinking, these stars mean a flood soon. Better warn everyone. The tablets accumulate slowly, year after year. Observations about star positions, notes about flood timing, records of harvest yields, the height of the river on specific dates, all written in a script that most people can't read, stored in a temple where most people aren't allowed, and maintained by a specialized class of people whose entire job is remembering and recording. Here's the uncomfortable part. This system only works if people believe it's sacred. If you tell farmers, I calculated this based on astronomical observations and historical data, they might listen. But if you tell them, the gods have spoken through the stars and the flood comes on this date, they'll actually prepare. Same information, different framing, drastically different results. So the warnings come wrapped in divination and prophecy, not because the record keepers are frauds, but because they understand human psychology in a preliterate society. The sacred is more powerful than the merely practical. The divine command trumps the expert suggestion. If you want people to listen to warnings, you make the warnings come from gods. The tablets themselves are fascinatingly dry when you translate them. Lists of observations, calculations, predictions. The occasional note about whether the prediction was accurate. They read less like mystical prophecies and more like an ancient farmer's almanac, which is essentially what they are. But that's not how they were presented to the broader population. You can see the same pattern in flood myths worldwide. The story of a great flood isn't unique to one culture. It appears independently in dozens of traditions across different continents. For a long time, people assumed this meant there was one actual global flood that everyone remembered. More likely, it means that many different societies experienced significant floods, and many of them encoded warnings about flooding in memorable narrative form. The Mesopotamian flood story, the one that eventually influenced the biblical account, contains oddly specific details about boat building. The dimensions given in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when you actually calculate them, describe a boat design that would be stable in rough water, not optimally efficient by modern standards, but definitely better than a random guess. Someone knew something about naval architecture and embedded it in mythology. Was there a historical Utnapishtim team who survived a catastrophic flood? Probably not. Were there multiple floods across many generations, and did the survivors pass down knowledge about boat building and flood preparation encoded in story form? Much more likely. The myth is a composite, a greatest hits collection of survival wisdom, starring a fictional hero but containing real information. The same thing happens with drought warnings. Societies that survived in marginal environments, deserts, semi-arid regions, places where rainfall varied dramatically year to year, developed elaborate systems for predicting and preparing for dry periods. These systems often involved watching animal behaviour, noting plant flowering times, observing weather patterns, and calculating based on long-term cycles. The problem is, long-term cycles are really hard to track without writing. If drought comes every 7 years, you need institutional memory spanning at least a few cycles to confirm the pattern. That's where ritual comes in. If you perform a specific ceremony every year and note whether drought follows, eventually you accumulate enough data to see the pattern. The ceremony isn't magic. It's a mnemonic device and a data collection protocol disguised as religion. Some of the most successful ancient societies were the ones that got really good at encoding environmental knowledge in cultural practices that persisted across generations. The ones that failed were often the ones that either never developed such systems or, more tragically, had systems that broke down at critical moments. Easter Island is a famous example, though the popular story tends to be oversimplified. The traditional narrative says the islanders cut down all their trees because they were obsessed with building bigger and bigger statues, ignoring obvious warnings until it was too late. The reality is more complicated and in some ways more disturbing. The islanders definitely had knowledge about sustainable forest management. Their traditions included practices that should have preserved the tree population. What seems to have happened is a combination of factors. Environmental changes they couldn't control, introduced rats that ate palm seeds faster than new trees could establish, and probably some degree of social dysfunction where competitive status building undermined collective resource management. But here's the interesting part. They had warnings. Their own traditions described proper land management. The warnings were there, embedded in cultural practices. The question isn't whether the knowledge existed, it's why it stopped being followed. That's a very different kind of failure, and a more disturbing one. because it suggests that having the information isn't always enough. Sometimes the warnings are ignored because short-term pressures override long-term thinking. Sometimes because social competition creates incentives to defect from cooperative resource management. Sometimes because the people who remember the warnings lose influence or status. Sometimes because the warnings themselves become so wrapped up in other cultural baggage that people can't separate the useful information from the outdated tradition. You see this tension constantly in historical records once writing becomes common enough. Arguments between people who want to preserve old practices and people who think the old ways are superstitious nonsense. Usually, both sides have a point. The old practices often do contain useful embedded knowledge, but they're also mixed with genuinely superstitious elements that served social functions rather than practical ones. Figuring out which is which, that's the hard part. And it's hard precisely because the encoding system works so well. The useful information and the social ritual became so thoroughly integrated that separating them requires exactly the kind of analytical thinking that wasn't available when the system was created. You're in Japan now, sometime in the early 17th century, in a coastal village that seems peaceful and prosperous. Fishing boats bob in the harbour. Children play on the beach. The houses are well built. The fields are productive. And life is good. Except there's this weird thing. The oldest buildings in the village aren't actually in the village. They're farther up the hill, maybe a quarter mile from the current settlement, on land that seems less convenient, less accessible, and less obviously desirable. When you ask why, you get vague answers about tradition, about ancestors, and about the proper way to build. Some villages have stone markers, really old ones, with inscriptions that say things like, "Do not build below this point." The inscriptions are weathered, barely legible, and obviously ancient. Most people know they're there but don't think much about them. Old religious thing probably. Superstition from a more ignorant time. December 22nd, 1615. Earthquake. Not unusual for Japan. They happen all the time. This one feels strong, sure, but houses are built to flex and sway. Some roof tiles fall. A few walls crack. Nobody dies in the village. People start cleaning up, making repairs, and being grateful it wasn't worse. Then someone notices the water in the harbour is behaving strangely, pulling back, way back, farther than the lowest tide. Boats are sitting on the exposed harbour bottom. Fish are flopping in puddles. It looks bizarre, unprecedented, and almost comical. The people who live in the houses up on the hill, the old houses built in the supposedly inconvenient location, start running farther uphill. They're screaming something about the water, about getting to high ground, about danger. They sound absolutely panicked, which seems like an overreaction. The earthquake is over, the worst of it anyway. 40 minutes after the earthquake, a wall of water roughly 30 feet high hits the coast. The village is gone in minutes. Hundreds of people drown. The houses on the hill, the ones that seem pointlessly far from the shore, untouched, wet, but standing. The people who listened to the old warnings, who remembered what those stone markers really meant. Alive. Japan has a word for this, tsunami, and the historical record shows they happen along that coast roughly every few generations. Not frequently enough that everyone remembers, not rare enough that they're irrelevant. Exactly the wrong frequency for human memory, where each generation grows up in the gap between events and decides the warnings are probably exaggerated. The stone markers were put there by survivors of previous tsunamis. Some were over 400 years old when the 1615 wave hit. The inscriptions weren't religious or metaphorical. They were literal instructions. High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point. Straightforward, clear, utterly ignored by people who thought they knew better. This pattern repeats itself across cultures and centuries. Warnings that seem superstitious or overcautious until the moment they're proven catastrophically accurate. The problem is, the proof usually comes too late to help the people who needed the warning most. You can find similar stories in volcanic regions. Villages with traditions about which mountainsides are safe and which are forbidden. The forbidden zones often correspond exactly to pyroclastic flow paths from previous eruptions that happened so long ago that they exist only in geological records and distorted cultural memory. Mount Vesuvius has a long history of eruptions before the famous one in 79 AD that destroyed Pompeii. The local populations knew the mountain was dangerous. They had stories about the god's anger, about fire from the mountain, and about the importance of making offerings to prevent catastrophe. What they'd lost was the specific knowledge of how bad it could get and how fast it could happen. The cultural memory had degraded from "this mountain can bury entire cities in a day" to "this mountain is sacred and sometimes dangerous. Respect it." Same basic source, very different level of useful detail. The warning was still there, technically. It just wasn't clear enough or specific enough to motivate people to actually leave. Pompeii is heartbreaking from this perspective. You can see in the archaeological record that some people tried to flee when the eruption started. Others sheltered in their homes, apparently thinking the safest course was to wait it out. Neither group understood what was coming. The cultural memory of how devastating a full Vesuvian eruption could be had faded across the generations of relative quiet. Here's the thing about volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, and other geological events. They operate on time frames that make them really difficult for human memory to handle. If a disaster happens every 5 years, you remember it. You prepare for it. You develop robust responses. If it happens every 500 years, though, that's roughly 20 generations. The first few generations after the event remember it vividly, build monuments, and create warnings. But each successive generation, growing up without direct experience of the danger, discounts the warnings a little more. Archaeologists find this pattern everywhere. Settlements built in flood zones that were clearly devastated by flooding in previous centuries. Cities reconstructed on the same spot after destruction, often with building techniques that replicate the vulnerabilities of the original. Coastal communities positioned exactly where previous coastal communities were wiped out by storms or tsunamis. It's not stupidity. It's the combination of fertile land, good harbours, and fading memory. The reasons to build in a particular spot are immediate and obvious. The reasons not to build there are historical and abstract. Unless you have strong institutional memory, writing, monuments, enforced traditions, the immediate always wins. The really fascinating cases are where you can track the memory degradation through historical records. A disaster happens. Survivors leave detailed accounts, dates, descriptions, impacts, and warnings to future generations. A century later, those accounts are still read and referenced, but they're starting to seem distant, possibly exaggerated. 2 centuries later, they're historical curiosities. 3 centuries later, they're folklore. 4 centuries later, they're largely forgotten except as a vague tradition. Then the disaster happens again, and someone discovers those old accounts and realizes they were completely accurate. This happened with the New Madrid earthquakes in the central United States. Massive earthquakes hit in 1811 and 1812. The ground liquefied. The Mississippi River temporarily ran backward. Church bells rang from the vibrations as far away as Boston. It was extensively documented and genuinely terrifying. Within 2 generations, people were building in the same areas as if nothing had happened. The written records existed, but the emotional urgency had faded. Today, those areas include major cities with infrastructure built to standards that wouldn't survive a repeat of the 1811 event. The warnings are there in historical records and geological surveys. They're just competing with 150 years of "but nothing bad has happened yet." Let's talk about food for a minute, because food-related warnings are some of the most interesting cases where mythology preserved genuinely useful information, while making it sound completely mystical. You're in ancient Greece, sometime around 400 BC, and you're hungry. Not desperately hungry, just regular human hungry. You see some mushrooms growing near the path. They look edible. Should you eat them? If you're smart, you consult the traditions. and the traditions tell you a complicated story about how some mushrooms are sacred to certain gods, how others are favoured by nymphs, and how still others are touched by underworld spirits and must never be consumed. The stories are elaborate, specific and memorable. They're also, when you strip away the mythology, a field guide to local mushrooms. The sacred to Demeter mushrooms, probably edible and nutritious. The favoured by nymphs ones, edible but with psychoactive properties. Consume carefully, in ritual context, not as casual snacks. The touched by underworld spirits. Those will absolutely kill you. The mythology encodes information that's more reliable than just guessing based on appearance. This pattern shows up in food traditions worldwide, kosher laws in Judaism, halal restrictions in Islam, Hindu dietary practices, Buddhist precepts about meat consumption, Polynesian kapu systems. When you look at them from a purely biological standpoint, most of them correlate with practices that reduce disease risk, prevent food poisoning, or manage resources sustainably in specific environments. Pork restrictions in Middle Eastern religions emerge in regions where pork is hard to raise sustainably, and where improperly cooked pork carries serious parasitic risks. Shellfish restrictions often align with seasonal toxin blooms. Prohibitions on mixing meat and dairy might reduce certain types of food poisoning in hot climates without refrigeration. The religious framework makes these practices mandatory and memorable, rather than optional and forgettable. Are these restrictions the only possible solution to the problems they address? Number. Modern food safety practices handle the same issues differently and often more effectively. But the religious restrictions worked for societies that didn't have refrigeration, lab testing, or pasteurization. They encoded practical knowledge in a format that didn't require scientific understanding to be useful. The same thing happens with seasonal food restrictions. Many traditional societies had elaborate rules about when you could and couldn't eat certain foods. These often sound arbitrary until you look at them ecologically. The restrictions tend to align with breeding seasons, migration patterns, or times when the food in question is nutritionally poor or potentially toxic. Pacific Northwest indigenous groups had traditions about when to harvest shellfish. These traditions included months when certain shellfish were taboo, forbidden for consumption. When scientists finally mapped paralytic shellfish poisoning events in the region, they found the taboo periods corresponded almost exactly with the highest risk months for algal blooms that make shellfish toxic. The traditional knowledge holders didn't know about dinoflagellate blooms or saxitoxin. They knew that people got sick when they ate shellfish during certain times, and they encoded that observation in cultural practice, enforced by social and spiritual sanctions. The mechanism didn't matter. The outcome did. You see similar patterns with agricultural timing, planting calendars tied to religious festivals, harvest rituals that also served as deadlines for getting crops in before the weather turned. Fallow periods were described as sacred rest for the land, but which, incidentally, prevented soil depletion and managed pest populations. The Roman calendar of festivals is a good example. It looks like pure religious observance until you map it against agricultural needs. Then you notice that major festivals conveniently fall right when specific farm tasks need to happen. The religious obligation ensured people coordinated their agricultural work, even when the immediate incentive might be to delay or skip crucial steps. Same with building practices. Feng Shui, when you strip away the mystical language, contains a lot of practical architectural knowledge about drainage, ventilation, light exposure, and protection from prevailing winds. The spiritual framework made these practices prestigious and ensured they were preserved and transmitted even when people didn't consciously understand the benefits. Viking settlements in marginal environments like Iceland and Greenland had elaborate traditions about building orientation, room design, and resource management. Many of these traditions seem arbitrary until you realize they're optimized for survival in environments with limited resources and harsh conditions. The proper way to build a longhouse turns out to be the way that maximizes heat retention and minimizes fuel consumption. Traditional Japanese building techniques developed in a seismically active region include design elements that modern engineers recognize as earthquake-resistant, flexible joints, foundation designs that absorb shock, weight distribution that makes structures more stable during shaking. These weren't developed through mathematical modelling. They emerged through centuries of trial and error, preserved as the proper way to build, and passed down as traditional knowledge. When you start looking for this pattern, you find it everywhere. Traditional medicine that actually works alongside the stuff that doesn't. Navigation techniques that sound like magic, but which encode real knowledge about currents, stars, and bird behaviour. Weather prediction based on animal behaviour that correlates with atmospheric pressure, changes humans can't directly sense, but animals apparently can. The tricky part is that it's all mixed together. Real knowledge and pure superstition, practical wisdom and social control, useful information and outdated tradition that serve different purposes in different contexts. You can't just accept all traditional knowledge as valid, but you also can't dismiss it all as primitive superstition. Each piece needs to be evaluated on its own merits. This is why ethnobotany became such an important field. Researchers realised that indigenous peoples had encyclopedic knowledge about local plants, their properties, their uses and their dangers. This knowledge was encoded in stories, traditions and practices that often sounded mystical or superstitious to outsiders. But when you actually tested the plants in question, you frequently found that the traditional uses had a biochemical basis. Willowbark tea for pain and fever contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, basically natural aspirin. Foxglove for heart conditions contains cardiac glycosides still used in modern medicine. Cinchona bark for malaria contains quinine. The list goes on. The traditional healers didn't know the chemical mechanisms. They knew that when you gave someone with certain symptoms a preparation made from a specific plant, the symptoms often improved. They encoded this knowledge in training systems, ritual practices, and stories that preserved the information across generations. Sometimes the encoding was remarkably precise. Dosage information hidden in ritual procedures, preparation methods that maximize beneficial compounds while minimizing toxic ones, contraindications disguised as spiritual prohibitions, all of it wrapped in frameworks that made the knowledge sacred and therefore worth preserving. Not all disasters announce themselves. The subtle ones, the ones that creep up over generations, are the hardest to warn about and the easiest to ignore. You're in the Maya lowlands, around 900 AD, in a city that will be abandoned within your lifetime. The problem isn't obvious. There's no invasion, no plague, no earthquake. The problem is water. Specifically, the slow, steady depletion of reliable water sources combined with irregular rainfall and increasing difficulty feeding a population that grew during good years and now can't be sustained during lean ones. The warning signs were there for generations. The monuments and inscriptions show increasingly frantic appeals to gods for rain. The archaeological evidence shows water management systems being expanded, modified, and desperately enhanced. The rulers knew something was wrong. The question is whether anyone else did, and whether anyone could have done anything about it even if they understood the problem. This is the hardest kind of warning to encode in mythology. The slow-moving disaster that doesn't have a clear beginning or end. That might be solvable if addressed early, but becomes catastrophic if ignored too long. How do you create a memorable warning about soil depletion, about groundwater levels dropping, about complex system feedback loops that take decades to manifest? The Maya had sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Their calendar systems were remarkable. Their mathematical achievements were genuinely impressive. What they apparently didn't have, or couldn't act on, was a clear understanding that their agricultural system was slowly degrading the environment that supported it. Or maybe they understood and couldn't change it. That's possibly more disturbing. The city-states were competing with each other. Each ruler needed to demonstrate power and prosperity. Admitting resource constraints would mean political weakness. The incentives all pushed toward maintaining growth even when the underlying resource base was clearly stressed. You see this same pattern in other slowly collapsing societies. Easter Island again, though the story's more complicated than the usual version. The ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest, who built elaborate settlements and then abandoned them as water sources failed. The Greenland Norse, who maintained European agricultural practices in an environment that increasingly couldn't support them, and apparently couldn't or wouldn't adapt to hunting-based lifestyles that would have been more sustainable. The warnings exist in these cases, but they're diffuse and arguable. Rain isn't as predictable as it used to be. Is that a trend or just normal variation? The harvest isn't as good as it was 20 years ago. Is that because of soil depletion, or just a run of bad luck? The forest seems thinner, but forests grow back, right? Without statistical analysis and long-term record keeping, these trends are really hard to distinguish from noise, and humans are spectacularly good at normalizing gradually worsening conditions. The baseline shifts with each generation. What seems obviously degraded to an outside observer seems normal to people who grew up with it. Psychologists call this shifting baseline syndrome. If you never experienced the previous state, you don't know it's been lost. Each generation accepts as normal the conditions they grew up with, even if those conditions are significantly degraded from what existed before. The slow decline becomes invisible because it's never dramatic enough to trigger alarm. This is why writing matters so much for preserving these kinds of warnings. Living memory only goes back so far. Stories can preserve information longer, but they're subject to the same baseline shifting. The forest was thick becomes the forest was thick, even as the actual forest keeps thinning, and the mental image of thick adjusts downward. Written records, ideally with quantitative measurements, can show the trend clearly. You can see that the grain yields really are declining, that the water table really is dropping, that the forest really is shrinking. Numbers don't shift their baseline the way human perception does. But even written records only help if people pay attention to them, and if the political and economic systems allow for action, based on long-term trends rather than short-term incentives. The tragedy of many collapsed societies isn't that they didn't know they were in trouble, it's that the social structure couldn't respond effectively to gradually mounting pressure. The Greenland Norse knew they were struggling. The records show they were aware conditions were deteriorating. What they couldn't do, apparently, was abandon the livestock-based economy and European identity that defined who they were. They kept trying to be European farmers in an environment that was becoming increasingly unsuitable for European farming, even as the indigenous Inuit population managed fine by hunting and fishing. Cultural identity became a trap. The warnings about needing to change were there, but accepting them would mean becoming something else, something that wasn't Norse in the way that mattered to them. So they stayed loyal to an identity and a set of practices that were killing them, and eventually the settlements failed. You can see the same dynamic in modern contexts. Industries facing obsolescence are fighting against adaptation. Communities refusing to relocate from flood zones or fire-prone areas, because that's where they've always been. People maintain unsustainable lifestyles because changing would mean admitting the old way doesn't work anymore. The warnings are there, the data is available, but accepting the warnings requires accepting change that feels like loss of identity or status or control. So the warnings are rationalized away, dismissed as exaggerated, and treated as problems for future generations to solve. Something interesting started happening in the 19th and 20th centuries. Archaeologists and anthropologists began taking traditional knowledge seriously, not as quaint folklore, but as potential sources of actual information about history and environment. You're in Crete in the early 1900s, watching Arthur Evans excavate Knossos. He's uncovering a Bronze Age palace that's remarkably sophisticated. Multiple stories, indoor plumbing, elaborate frescoes, evidence of a complex bureaucracy and extensive trade networks. A civilization that Greek mythology remembered as the kingdom of King Minos, and the labyrinth that held the Minotaur. Now, there's obviously no actual Minotaur. But Evan starts noticing something interesting. The palace really is maze-like, with corridors that twist and turn and double back. There are bull motifs everywhere in the artwork. The architecture is complex enough that someone unfamiliar with it could easily get lost. The myth of the labyrinth and the Minotaur suddenly looks less like pure fiction and more like a distorted memory of an actual place. A palace complex associated with bull worship or bull sacrifice, remembered across the Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse, transformed in the retelling into a monster story but preserving core details about the place and the culture. This opened a door. If the labyrinth myth had a basis in reality, what about other myths? What about flood stories, dragon legends, and tales of lost cities and sunken lands? The answer turned out to be complicated. Some myths are pure fiction, others are distorted memories of real events. Still others preserve information about geology, astronomy, or natural phenomena encoded in narrative form. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis is a fascinating case. There's geological evidence that around 5600 BC, the Black Sea underwent catastrophic flooding when rising Mediterranean sea levels breached the Bosporus. The water level rose hundreds of feet over a relatively short period, maybe months or years rather than centuries. Coastal settlements would have been inundated. Now, did this event directly inspire the Noah's Ark story and similar flood myths from the region? That's arguable and probably unprovable, but it demonstrates that the kind of catastrophic flooding described in those myths absolutely happened in regions where the myths originated. The myths aren't necessarily records of the specific event, but they're not entirely invented either. They're memories of the kind of thing that happened, encoded in story form and preserved across millennia. Dragon myths are another interesting case. Dinosaur fossils have been found in many regions where dragon legends exist. Did ancient peoples find these fossils, recognize them as bones, and construct the idea of dragons to explain them? Almost certainly yes in many cases. The fossils are real. The interpretation is creative. The myth preserves both. The knowledge that giant reptilian creatures existed, and a culturally specific explanation of what they were. Some dragon legends even preserve surprisingly accurate anatomical details when you compare them to the fossils found in the same regions. Chinese dragon descriptions correlate weirdly well with local theropod fossils. European dragon legends often match the general body plan of sauropods. The ancients were doing paleontology. They just didn't have evolutionary theory or geological timescales to contextualize their findings. Volcano myths similarly preserve real information. The Greek legend of Typhon, a monster buried under Mount Etna whose struggles cause earthquakes and eruptions, is obviously not literally true, but it preserves the knowledge that Etna is geologically active, that eruptions and earthquakes are connected, and that the mountain has been dangerous for as long as anyone can remember. The monster is a mnemonic device for geological truth. Indigenous Australian oral traditions describe events that, when checked against geological and archaeological evidence, appear to preserve memories of sea level changes from the end of the last ice age. Events that happened over 10,000 years ago. Stories about lands that are now underwater, about the sea rising and covering what was once dry ground, match precisely with what geological surveys show actually happened. How do oral traditions preserve information for 10,000 years? Through the same mechanisms we've been discussing, encoding in memorable narrative form, making the stories sacred or culturally important, passing them down through specialized knowledge keepers, and maintaining them through ritual repetition. It's an incredibly robust system for preserving information, even if it distorts and mythologizes in the process. The challenge for modern researchers is developing methods to extract the factual core from the mythological packaging. Some methods are pretty straightforward. If a myth describes a volcano erupting, check whether there's geological evidence of eruptions in that region during the time frame when the culture existed. If the myth describes flooding, look for flood deposits or evidence of sea level changes. Other cases require more sophisticated analysis, computational linguistics to trace how stories changed as they spread, genetic analysis to track human migrations that might have carried stories with them, climate reconstruction to understand what environmental conditions people were experiencing when they created specific myths. There's a whole field now called geomythology that specifically studies the geological events preserved in myths and legends. Researchers systematically go through traditional stories looking for descriptions that might correspond to earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, floods, and other natural phenomena, then check whether the geological record supports those events. The results are fascinating. Many myths turn out to preserve genuinely useful information about local hazards. The Cascadia subduction zone, which generates massive earthquakes every few hundred years along the Pacific Northwest coast, is documented in indigenous oral traditions that describe the last major event around 1700 AD. Those traditions were largely dismissed by European settlers, but geological evidence confirmed they were accurate. Similarly, Australian Aboriginal stories about volcanic eruptions in regions that are now dormant turned out to correlate with geological evidence of eruptions thousands of years ago. The stories preserved information about which mountains were dangerous, even after they'd been quiet for so long that direct memory had faded. This process of rediscovering ancient warnings through scientific analysis is ongoing. Every year brings new examples of traditional knowledge that turns out to be accurate, and warnings that were dismissed as superstition, but which encoded genuine understanding of environmental risks and natural phenomena. The tragedy is how much knowledge was lost when cultures were disrupted or destroyed. How many warnings went unheard because the people who preserved them were marginalized or killed? How much information is gone forever because we didn't think to record it before the last person who remembered it died? Here's where things get uncomfortable, because this isn't just about ancient peoples and their quaint myths. We're still doing it, right now. Ignoring warnings that are encoded in historical records, geological surveys, climate data, and scientific analysis. Dismissing expert knowledge because it conflicts with what we want to believe or what's economically convenient. You're in New Orleans in 2005 and Hurricane Katrina is approaching. The warnings have been clear for decades. The city is below sea level. The levees aren't built to withstand a major hurricane. The wetlands that once provided natural storm protection have been degraded. Disaster planners have been saying for years that a direct hit from a major hurricane would be catastrophic. And then it happens exactly as predicted. The levees fail, the city floods, thousands of people die or lose everything. And in the aftermath, everyone acts surprised, as if this was an unforeseeable tragedy, rather than a disaster that had been explicitly warned about for generations. This is the modern version of building below the tsunami stones. The warnings were there. The knowledge existed. The scientific understanding was clear. The political and economic systems just couldn't or wouldn't act on information that would have required difficult, expensive, long-term planning. Climate change is the ultimate example. The warnings have been clear since at least the 1980s. The data keeps getting stronger. The predictions keep being confirmed by observation, and yet the response remains glacially slow, because acting on the warnings would require massive economic restructuring, and because the worst consequences seem distant and abstract. It's the same pattern we've been discussing throughout. Warnings that seem urgent to people with long-term perspective and specialised knowledge, but which get filtered through social, political and economic systems that privilege short-term thinking and immediate payoffs. Future archaeologists, assuming they exist, will probably look back at our era with the same baffled frustration that we feel looking at societies that built in tsunami zones or overgrazed their land into desert. The warnings were all there. Why didn't they listen? The answer is the same as it has always been. Warnings compete with other priorities. They require accepting uncomfortable truths. They demand changes that feel costly or disruptive. They ask people to prepare for events that might not happen in their lifetime. All of this is hard, and it's always been hard, and there's no reason to think we're any better at it than our ancestors were. But here's the thing. We do have one advantage they lacked. We have comprehensive written records. We have scientific methods. We have the ability to model complex systems and make quantitative predictions. You can't claim we don't know what happens when you ignore environmental warnings, or build in hazardous locations or deplete resources faster than they regenerate. The knowledge is available, the warnings exist. Whether we listen to them is a choice, not an inevitability. Some places do listen. The Netherlands has built one of the most sophisticated flood control systems in the world because they learned, over centuries of devastating floods, that you either manage water or it manages you. Japan has strict building codes and public education about earthquakes and tsunamis because they've learnt the cost of ignoring those risks. These aren't perfect systems. They fail sometimes, but they represent societies that took historical warnings seriously and built infrastructure and institutions around the knowledge that certain disasters were inevitable and required permanent vigilance. Other places keep learning the same lessons over and over, building in fire-prone areas, overdrawing aquifers, developing coastal regions that will be underwater in a few decades. The warnings are ignored not because they're unclear, but because accepting them would be inconvenient. The ancient myths weren't just stories, they were survival guides. The problem is, we've gotten so good at ignoring our own modern versions, the scientific reports, the historical data, the expert warnings, that we've recreated the same dynamic, just with better documentation of our own failure to listen. Here's something that would be funny if it weren't tragic. We're better at decoding ancient warnings than acting on modern ones. Archaeologists can look at settlement patterns and say, they ignored obvious flood risk and paid the price. And then we go home to cities with the same vulnerabilities. We study collapsed societies that overexploited their resources and then continue policies that do exactly the same thing at a global scale. The warnings from the past aren't just about understanding history. They're mirrors showing us our own behaviour. The same psychological and social dynamics that made ancient peoples ignore warnings about earthquakes or floods or resource depletion are still operating. We haven't evolved beyond those limitations. We just have them documented in more detail. Sometimes the most important warnings are the ones that don't exist. The absence of certain myths or traditions can tell you as much as their presence. If a culture has elaborate earthquake preparation rituals, you know they experienced earthquakes frequently enough to develop cultural responses. If they have no such traditions, it might mean earthquakes are rare in that region, or it might mean they never survived an earthquake long enough to develop traditions about it. This is the dark side of traditional knowledge. It only exists for hazards that people survived often enough to learn from. The truly catastrophic, truly rare events might leave no cultural memory at all. If everyone in a coastal region drowns in a tsunami that happens once every 1,000 years, who's left to pass down the warning? Archaeology reveals this pattern through the ruins, settlements that were clearly destroyed suddenly and completely, with no evidence of rebuilding on the same site. Whatever happened was bad enough that survivors either couldn't return or chose not to. The cultural knowledge about that specific disaster died with the settlement. This creates dangerous gaps. Modern development might happen in exactly those catastrophically risky areas, because there's no cultural memory of the risk, no local tradition warning against it. The absence of warnings gets interpreted as safety rather than as the absence of survivors who could warn. The Pacific Northwest earthquake risk is a good example. Because major Cascadia events happen roughly every 300 to 600 years, European settlers arrived during a quiet period. There were no earthquakes in living memory, no written records. The indigenous oral traditions that preserved the warnings were dismissed or ignored. So development proceeded as if the region were geologically stable. It's not stable. It's a subduction zone capable of magnitude 9 earthquakes and devastating tsunamis. The last one happened in 1700. The next one is coming. But for generations people built there without understanding the risk, because the cultural memory had been disrupted and the geological memory wasn't yet understood. We're better at reading geological memory now. Core samples, sediment layers, tree ring analysis, radiocarbon dating. We can find the evidence of events that left no cultural memory. because they were too devastating or too rare for oral tradition to preserve. But that raises a disturbing question. What are we still missing? What geological risks exist that happen so rarely that even our historical records don't capture them? We've been keeping detailed scientific records for maybe 2 centuries. That's nothing on geological timescales. Supervolcanoes erupt every 50,000 to 100,000 years or so. Our entire civilization has developed in the gap between events. We know they happened. The geological evidence is clear, but we have no cultural memory of what it's like to live through one. No traditions about how to survive or prepare, because no human society has experienced one and survived in a way that preserved useful information. The same applies to asteroid impacts large enough to cause global devastation. They happen, but on timescales so long that we have no cultural or even species memory of the last major one. The warnings exist only in our scientific understanding of probability and in the geological record of ancient impacts. This is where modern science becomes our new form of cultural memory. We're encoding warnings about risks that no previous human has survived, based on physical evidence and mathematical modelling rather than direct experience. The question is whether our institutions are robust enough to maintain and act on these warnings across the centuries or millennia before the risks materialise. It's a weird situation. Ancient peoples encoded knowledge from direct experience into myths that got distorted but survived for thousands of years. We're trying to encode knowledge from abstract analysis into institutions and records that might or might not survive long enough to be useful. Which system is more reliable? Honestly, it's not clear. The mythological encoding was remarkably robust but lost precision and clarity. Scientific recording is precise but depends on institutional continuity that's hard to maintain across long time periods. If you step back and look at the whole sweep of human history, a pattern emerges. It's not a happy pattern. Societies develop in environments they don't fully understand. Through trial and error, often painful, they accumulate knowledge about how to survive in those environments. This knowledge gets encoded in cultural practices, stories, and traditions. For a while, the system works. The warnings are heeded. The practices are followed. Then conditions change, or memory fades, or competing priorities emerge. The warnings start to seem overblown or irrelevant. New generations who haven't experienced the disasters firsthand discount the old stories. Development happens in places that were traditionally avoided. Practices that protected against specific risks are abandoned as superstitious. And then the disaster happens again. The flood, the earthquake, the famine, the collapse. Survivors realize the old warnings were accurate. The cycle begins again. This has happened so many times that you'd think we'd learn. But the learning keeps getting lost. Each iteration thinks it's different, that the old warnings don't apply, and that modern knowledge or technology has solved the underlying problems. Sometimes that's true. Modern earthquake engineering really does make buildings safer than traditional construction in many cases. Modern flood control can manage risks that would have been unmanageable in the past. Scientific understanding allows us to predict and prepare for disasters in ways our ancestors couldn't, but the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. We still build in risky places because they're economically attractive. We still discount long-term risks for short-term gains. We still struggle to maintain institutional memory across generations. We still have trouble acting on warnings about disasters that haven't happened yet in living memory. The myths were warnings. The archaeological ruins are warnings. The historical records are warnings. The scientific data are warnings. We're surrounded by warnings, layers upon layers of accumulated human experience with catastrophe and collapse. And we're still, in many cases, not listening. Because listening would be inconvenient, or expensive, or politically difficult, or because the warnings are about things that seem distant and abstract. The ancient peoples who built below the tsunami stones had reasons too. Good reasons from their perspective, better land, closer to resources. The old warnings seemed exaggerated. Nothing bad had happened in living memory. We're doing the same thing, just with better documentation of our decision-making process. If you're reading this in some far future, after whatever disasters our current societies are ignoring finally happen, here's what we knew, and when we knew it. We knew climate was changing. We had detailed measurements, sophisticated models, and clear warnings about consequences. The knowledge existed by the late 20th century at the latest. We chose to act slowly and inadequately, with lots of arguing about costs and responsibility. We knew many coastal cities were vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. The engineering was clear. We kept building there anyway. We knew our agricultural systems were depleting soil and groundwater. We knew our consumption patterns were unsustainable. We knew plastic was accumulating in the oceans. We knew biodiversity was crashing. We had reports, data, and scientific consensus. All the warnings existed. We're not innocent. We're not ignorant. We're just bad at acting on information about slow-moving long-term problems, especially when the solutions would require changing comfortable patterns or confronting powerful interests. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same story that's played out in collapsed societies throughout history. The details change, the underlying dynamic doesn't. Here's hoping you future people are better at this than we were, but honestly you'll probably have your own warnings that you're ignoring, your own slow catastrophes that seem too distant or too expensive to address. That's apparently what humans do. The myths were warnings. This is a warning too. Not from gods or spirits, but from the simple observation that ignoring long-term risks in favour of short-term convenience rarely ends well. The ancient warnings weren't myths. They were instructions. The tragedy isn't that people forgot them. It's that each generation has to relearn the same lessons, usually the hard way, because the warnings never feel urgent enough until it's too late. So if you're from the future, sifting through our ruins and wondering why we didn't change course when all the information was available, now you know, we knew. We just didn't act on what we knew, because that's what humans do. We're really good at encoding warnings for future generations. We're much worse at listening to the warnings previous generations left us. The myths weren't myths, they were survival guides. By the time you realise that, you've usually already ignored them. That's the pattern. That's always been the pattern. And unless something fundamental changes in how humans process risk and time and collective action, it'll probably keep being the pattern. Welcome to the human condition. We're really good at learning from experience. We're just terrible at learning from warnings about experiences we haven't had yet, even when those warnings come from people who already had those experiences and tried to tell us what to expect. The stories were true. That's the thing nobody wants to believe until it's too late. The old warnings, the ancient instructions, the myths that sounded too dramatic to be real. They were usually based on something. They were encoding knowledge that cost previous generations dearly to acquire. And then we ignore them anyway, because that's what humans do. Sweet dreams.